Thank you for joining us for the Digital Practice Award of Excellence presentation. I'm Leslie Locke, Assistant Professor at Cornell University Department of Architecture, and I'm a member of the ACADIA Board of Directors. It is my distinct honor to introduce this year's award recipient, Nader Tehrani, for NADAAA. Introducing Nader is no small task because he needs no introduction. And it's even more challenging because he was my first-year studio professor. As a principal designer of NADAAA, a practice dedicated to the advancement of design innovation, interdisciplinary collaboration, and an intensive dialogue with the construction industry, Nader led the practice impactful evolution over 3 decades with a focus on the transformation of building industry, innovative material applications, and the development of new means and methods of constructions, especially through digital fabrication. And rather than focus on typology, Nader's and NADAA's portfolio is built on process, one that is grounded in thoughtful considerations of materials, detail, structure, and tectonic expression. Nader's unwavering commitment to the interplay and reciprocity between these design elements is evident in all the projects, regardless of scale or complexity, be it institutional, academic, housing, civic undertakings, or commercial, each marked by inventive architectural expression. For his contribution to architecture as an art, Nader Tehrani is a recipient of the 2020 Arnold Brunner Memorial Prize for the American Academy of Arts and Letters, to which he was also elected as a member in 2021, the highest form of recognition of artistic merit in the United States. Apart from his fully engaged practice, Nader is also a teacher. He is a professor at the Irwin Chanin School of Architecture at the Cooper Union, and previously served as the dean of the college of the school. He has also held the position of professor at architecture at MIT, where he served as the head of the department from 2010 to 2014. It was during that time at MIT that I had the privilege of having Nader as my first-year instructor. He was a formidable critic, sometimes daunting, but one who left an enduring impact on his students' growth as rigorous thinkers and designers. In Nader's own words regarding his work for his project at the Venice Architectural Biennale in 2021, he used the terms analytical, projective, and constructive to describe the 3 projects, the very lens through which he imparts design thinking to his students. He is for sure one who practices what he teaches. So without further ado, please help me in welcoming Nader Tehrani. Thank you, Nader. Yeah.
Oh, we
Sorry.
did.
Photo.
Thank you. Okay. It is somewhat intimidating to present to this audience, in great part because oh goodness. 1 second, please. Well, whatever. I think I'll just go ahead. The lecture, The Animate analytique is dedicated to a mode of drawing that I was very fascinated with, in part the 19th century Beaux-Arts technique of hybrid compositions that serve as fragments describing a whole. But at the moment that I was then appointed as the dean of the Irwin S. Chanin School of Architecture, I also came full circle in confrontation with the work of John Haydock, whose legacy served as the foundation of the school for over 30 years, and coming into recognition with what I found were some of the more formidable moments of his pedagogy. And this drawing is just one of the many chapters where you see the relationship between the plan and the elevation come into formation precisely through the collapse of projection, something that normally would seem illegible precisely because of the 90-degree angle. But in his case, the agency of that, the instrumentality of that kind of drawing allows him to rotate the non-supporting walls within the context of the free plan, which is suggestive of a way of drawing and thinking at the same time. So the notion that drawings don't illustrate a preconceived idea, but that drawings are always already a mode of thinking through an idea, that the ideas evolve after the fact. Now, within that context, I was asked to do a drawing for the storefront for art and architecture. And I realized that somehow this is something that Stephen Hall would never have done, but I wanted to apply the animate thinking to his project. Here you see the elevation rendered, as it were, in perspective, one point. The rotation of that as a flat axonometric. Its rotation to show the thin end and the wide end. The line work is not showing, my apologies. And going from orthogonal projection to conical, slipping inside to see the projection itself, and then finally a rotation to a realist mode as we open the doors once again and frame the views of the outside, in a way capturing certain ideas embedded in different representational modalities compressed into one. It's not a collage, it's more of a montage where these different modalities are brought into confrontation, where normally they would be done in what I would call an analytique, the French Beaux-Arts technique that we've seen, that projected often Renaissance relics, projections for archaeological digs that would imagine architectures that they didn't actually know existed, but through the fragment, a kind of design process would ensue. And the idea that even the fragments may have inconsistencies in them to demonstrate possible different ways of having conceived of the project. So translating that to the work of Daniel Castor is an important part of this talk. A classmate of mine many, many years ago, who did a Mode B thesis at Harvard with the project of analyzing Berlache's Exchange building, which involves some of the most foundational things that I imagine all of you would find rather rudimentary and boring, but that is at the core of this discussion. And that is why we draw, why do we draw this way, and where might it lead us? And I think his thinking had a significant impact on me. And he really brought it back to the kind of 101 level, you know, the idea that he went to the building, took photographs of it, established the elevations, folded them out as you might in any archaeological dig. And we applied that to a project, which I'll show you very quickly now. The project spans over 20, 30 years ago, but it is the means through which I drew and then learned to draw again, and then again, and then again through your generations. And now, as I look into the crowds, you're pretty monolithic as a generation, but I would say that your grandfathers and your parents are also represented here. So I'm learning how to draw again and again, basically going from sketching to drafting to AutoCAD to FormZ, and then to Rhino, and then of course to scripting at the end. So this is what you know best, so I'm not going to belabor it. But essentially, this is at the moment I was in partnership with Monica Ponce de Leon, where we went to Caracas and discovered the kind of terracotta blocks, bricks, and tiles. And I did this sketch on site, which effectively articulates what was possible to do for Casa La Roca. Not an entire courtyard building, but an L-shaped courtyard building with one brick screen wall that effectively blocks the in-laws next door, opening up to them, but also concealing them, but framing the view of the rock after which the house is named. Now, keep your eyes on the sketch to the left, which effectively shows a mode of thinking through drawing that would be a brick wall that through the fold gives lateral stability, something you are well versed with in the work of Eladio Dieste, Candela, etc., etc. And within that context, bringing the discipline of drafting, the projection of a composite drawing from plan to elevation, to invent what we thought was the variable bond being essentially a rejection of the running bond on the one end or the Flemish bond on the other, but the idea that the mortar is the main protagonist here because it varies in dimension, a parametric construct intellectually speaking, drawn here in pencil to allow for the passage of light and air through what is a wall that is conceptually and figuratively a curtain wall. Importantly, it also is a moment where you begin to see the instrumentality, not just of drawing, but materiality playing a role in that tectonics. The brick is not cut at that most critical moment of the junction of the diagonal. That is exactly the element that allows for the incremental corbelling to happen and the dovetailing of the brick. Here, the model is not used as an illustration. It's a simulation of construction, although it's a 1/2 inch to 1 scale model. It's about 2 feet tall by 6 feet long. It explains the kind of pre-installation mode of working that we were undertaking before we entered into a world that you are also very familiar with. The next chapter is when we actually learned how to do animations and established a dialectical relationship between the animate process and the photographic one, showing a kind of connection between the two, and the demonstration that at the end of the day, what you're doing when you're designing this wall is you're drawing out a very low resolution ruled surface. In other words, you're not connecting the lines, the two upper and lower lines with lines, but with essentially bricks that are incrementally rotating in order to do so. I think everybody in this room has done one form of this or another. This is a chapter that you know all very well also, and it has to do with the advent of scripting that came again 10 years later, which is now illustrating, drawing out the variable bonds, what had been conceptualized 2 decades earlier, but now here learning how to script something in a language which is non-visual, but that has radical compositional and visual implications, and then advancing that to the morphology of the building. Keep your eyes not on the center of the page, but really at the four corners, because it is all being done numerically at this point. And again, I nod my head to all of you who actually know how to do this in your dreams and sleep, what I still struggle with to this day. Anyway, so I take your attention back to Daniel Castor's work, who also takes us to that delicate passage, as you go from plan to elevation to section, and then to axonometric, and particularly to the idea of the choisi, reminding us that often it is not God's vision of looking down on architecture, but actually the reflected ceiling plan, or the RCP, or the ceiling that is the protagonist of architecture. St. Peter's is not a dome, it's two domes. And so the dome that you see on the inside is a different one than you see on the outside. And the choisi is one of the modalities that explains that. And you could say the subheading of this talk is also about the reflected ceiling plan. It's just another way to begin to get into this discussion. So as he progresses on the research and he begins to describe the different ways of drawing, one of the most interesting chapters is, of course, the isometric, where the 120, 120, 120 angle gives an equal weight to the plan and the two facets of the elevation. As you well know, a sectional oblique, gives dominance to the section or the elevation, as a plan oblique gives dominance to the plan. This is one where the neutrality of them means that there's something else at work. In this second instance, when you see the bullioning of the volume, you realize that what we invest in together in architecture is not the surface necessarily, but is the correspondence between the inside and the outside. If I can say, you're not interested in the body, but you're interested in the organs as much as you are in the body itself. And then all of a sudden he gets to the flip-flop representation, which, completely changes everything, because the picture plane, that is the section of the window, is being looked down upon and up at it at the same time. And only the isometric allows you to do that, because the angles are equal. So that inversion is made possible so that you're looking up at the vaults from the inside, but from the outside, you're looking down on the stairs. And this allows you to be able to not only imagine projectively how a project may be designed, but also how to analytically take something apart. Something I doubt Berlachar was doing while designing, but this is now Castor doing this for us. Now, of course, he's not alone. El Lissitzky and many others have done things like this in the 20th century, but it's also a way of identifying a kind of a disciplinary function that we all participate in. Anyway, I was asked to go to the American Academy a few years ago, and I saw in their billiards room a drawing by Michael Graves, very gestural, very rough, of the Tempietto, something you may have imagined done by Gehry, and so very un-Graves-like, but it inspired me to go visit it again. It's only 100 yards away. And there are two things that are evident in visiting this project. The first is that, the axiality of the frame door into the courtyard and its relationship to the mantle, which is an extension of the poche of the wall, the thickness and the mass of the wall, the kind of solidity of this, displaced from the center, the kind of the mantle, the apse is off center. Many of you have read the Robin Evans article that describes that, only to discover that as you round out towards the back, that this solid mass is a thin veneer. That mantelpiece is actually a thin slab of stone that makes a collusion between mantle and window. There is, as you walk around towards the back, a staircase and an oculus, a window actually, which ends up being an oculus that brings light to the crypt behind it. Sorry, this is not advancing. There you go. There is no window without the mantle. There is no mantle without the window. These two come into dialogue with each other, which makes it all the more alluring as you realize that, and I didn't know this initially, that St. Peter's was planted upside down, looking up towards the sky, effectively looking at the reflected ceiling plan. That the cross was not planted like Jesus allows for a drawing like this conceptually to be done after the fact, 6 drawings and done in one, looking down at the dome, up at the dome, down at the mantle, up at the oculus, and then down at the plan of the crypt, and of course looking up at St. Peter's, looking back up. Again, a flip-flop building done in the manner of Castor, but here done to a project which is not indifferent to the conceptual function of the flip-flop. So as we begin to apply this format of thinking to the projects, and I'll try to go fast in all of this in a more descriptive way, using the animations both as generative as well as post game analysis of the projects. In the context of the Melbourne School of Design, we were tasked with, the design of a permanent studio space in an institution that had only had hot desks for many, many years to rival it with RMIT. And after a month, realizing they didn't have the budget for the studios, we had to find a diagram, a financial diagram to widen the corridors, essentially alter the net to gross relationships to make a vertical studio space of hot desks, housing something around 1,000 to 1,500 students for what is otherwise a 2,000 student body, and then robbing spaces behind them as you expand the studio space into classrooms, into exhibition halls, and so forth, in critical hours where you gain more momentum. So it's about timing and scheduling how this works, and then the stacking of the FF&E package to begin to articulate the guards of that atrium space. So at one level, essentially creating collaborative tables for model making, for small conferencing, going up drafting tables, and then going up again crit spaces, all being shared by, of course, architecture, construction, urban design, landscape. And so beginning to imagine in an interdisciplinary format rooted in the principle of shared space. All of this coming down around a dedicated studio space, what is the suspended studio within the center. And that, of course, harks back to the Tempietto in a meditation of what it means to do an object versus fabric. Of course, the Tempietto is the object. It's a monument within what is otherwise a medieval fabric around it, reinforced by what Gehry does in Berlin with the kind of zoomorphic head inside of the fabric of the office building. And in Kahn, an interesting meditation on a slippage where there is a dialogue between the structural frame of the concrete and the figure of the stair. What we try to advance by creating a more organic relationship between the ceiling and the studio spaces. So spanning 120 feet with LVLs that are almost 8-9 feet deep, rotating the coffering so that you get natural light, but not direct sun. And then out of the mass of that wood, suspending structure in tension, occupying the void of the monolithic wood in tension until you are at the thinness of plywood by the time you get to the bottom. So essentially a kind of reverse tectonic as one experiences the levity of an architecture upside down at the bottom of the earth. Mostly prefabricated. This is a project that was conceived for 24 months of construction, done actually in 18. And of course, all done through BIM in a way that affords the kind of triangulated dialogue between design, engineering, and fabrication, and the insertion of an idea in there. You know, upside down at the bottom of the earth is a meditation also on Lawrence's text of their most horrible 6 months they spent down there fighting with each other, he and his wife. And in our case, you know, taking that metaphor and saying, you know, what would it mean if the foundation of the building were not the ground, but the roof? And so inverting the rustication and suspending the thickness at the top and the thinness at the bottom. You literally inhabit that thickness at the top in the studios and conference rooms, and then you see the thinness of the veneers in the acoustic baffles at the bottom, with another outdoor, not outdoor, but an open conference area in the atrium below. All of which comes together in this incredibly occupied social space. I would love to say that it's all design students in this. It's actually successful so much that people from the rest of the school are coming here, and everybody's quite unhappy about that. Other aspects of this building have to do with the kind of interdisciplinary environment and the Joseph Reed facade, an existing relic on the site, never meant to be there, imported from downtown Melbourne, always blocked up without windows or doors. Part of our task was to reinvigorate this classical facade by A, mapping it, B, putting structure behind it, mapping out the windows, inserting voids in them, rekindling the light and the passage of the thresholds and the doors in it, and then giving it lateral stability, anchoring it back into the building, and using that lateral stability to create a void of a classroom, an open classroom within the context of its interior. That space, I mean, that again, another reflected ceiling plan, which morphs essentially the logic of the interior facade into the belly of the classroom, and the classroom is inserted up there as a kind of balcony. The idea of the animate analytique plays a more descriptive role here, but certainly a central part of the Villa Varroise in southern France, that takes place in a landscape which is quite beautiful and agricultural, but obviously located in a very dense McMansion neighborhood, with our effort to make a landscape project rather than an architectural project, inserting two levels, a level of bedrooms at the lower level in red, and the living and master suite at the top overlooking them. All of it coming around the hinge points at the corners of the plans, where the staircases circulationally and structurally tethering the two corners of the house together. The staircase is a cantilever. The front facade is a beam, and the typology is dependent on the structural motif to make it work. The engulfing of that stair also becomes the mechanism through which the threshold into the courtyard is formed. The plan distorted to allow for the views to the Mediterranean and to the west where the Pinus Pinei are. The rotation from plan to plan oblique shows that it's not on one level, it's on a sloped landscape, therefore the terracing of the two wings. The rotation from axonometrics to perspective, slowly revealing the roof that opens up towards the west. And finally, the rotation from 50-degree lengths to 15 to show the dynamism of the threshold that brings you up into the courtyard and up through the building and into the landscape on the western end. The constructed version of the same thing in concrete, revealing the beam through which certain apertures are inserted into the master suite. The beam, the front facade, is in fact suspended off of the retaining wall of the pool that is, in a way, a retaining wall of the sloped earth, but also what holds the whole house together. So you penetrate that also as a beam as you get in from the master suite to its office. The front door, the ruled surface of the threshold underneath the front door that takes you into the courtyard. I won't go into too much description of it except to say that the board forming is effectively a constructive illustration of the ruled surface as you connect the top and the bottom lines. The reflected ceiling plan that is the tool that gets you from here to there, and the side elevation which effectively shows the terracing and the kind of outline of the stair that has been engulfed in the massing of that elevation. The top level then effectively is like a case study house, a glass volume that looks over the Mediterranean. You would think laterally structured, but in fact is vaulted longitudinally almost 70 feet to allow for a large vault to connect you back to the western side, not only gaining light, but the passage of air that goes from the east to the west. And so these connections to the Pinus Pinei are a central part of the conceptualization of a house that absorbs the light in very different ways throughout the day, with the RCP being, again, a critical protagonist that brings the house all together. Here again, a framing of that view of the outdoor-indoor relationship that is the critical part of the house, your capacity to stand absolutely nude with the two wings protecting your body from the neighbors, which are only a few feet away, and then the horizon of the Mediterranean beyond. Also a reminder, very differently than the rest of our work, that concrete does not abide by the rules of aggregation. The notion of a 2x4 or a 4x8 panel, a concrete block or a brick, that concrete is a liquid medium. And so we were looking at different modalities of pouring concrete, where either A, the formwork is the index for its representation, or post-architectural hammering becomes the mechanism by which expression is given to it. All of you are familiar with fabric formed work, both historic and contemporary of our own colleagues. And we were testing out different ways which ultimately we could not afford, but I thought for you it would be interesting to show it, and ultimately came around to the idea of the ethic of the aggregate becoming a central part of the representation of this thing. This in Taliesin is something you all know of, but the aggregate becomes so large that it becomes part of the manifestation of the landscape within the concrete wall. So we asked ourselves, what would it mean to go from the smoothness of the finish of the interior, pouring segments such that the incremental growth of that aggregate within each panel reverses the figure ground of the mortar to stone, such that as by the end, as you're in the countryside, in the retaining wall is just a French stone wall that delineates the property. So the kind of the gradient evolution of the aggregate going essentially from a concrete steel wall to a stone wall. And here, of course, the value engineered version, you end up sandblasting the wood using the local aggregate, which is quite orange and amber, where the concrete is masquerading itself literally as wood on the left side. One of the most exciting aspects of Castor's description of the Berlage building is the jellyfish, and the idea that the jellyfish, you can see the front and the back at the same time. The simultaneity of being able to see the front and the back is a critical part of his dissection of that building. And the rest of the book is committed to a series of these sort of fragments of the building where he objectifies rooms, looks through the front towards the back to essentially show the anatomy of the building rather than what we think of as the representation of the facade. And so this kind of thinking is very much present within our work, even though I will not show you that directly in the Adams Library, which is a participatory design process which essentially extracts any control you have of the design of a library into the hands of the community, involving elderly, adolescents, and kids, to create essentially a plan that is trifold with three wings that brings all of them together around a center, the control station, a panoptic center within which all of them can somehow be controlled. The story of that library is that it's also on one floor with a monumental single pitch facade on the front side, and the back facade being broken down to the scale of the domestic residential neighborhood, the roof of which is the central protagonist of this thing, the fifth facade, and of course the sixth, the reflected ceiling plan, allowing for the passage of water to a garden in the back, the extraction of a southern court to allow for southern light, and the framing of a large oak tree that we saved as an outdoor reading room. The three wings are then shelved on the north-south axis, while then the beams run on the east-west axis, forming, again, a ruled surface described by beams, acoustic baffles, lighting, mechanical systems that are part of the experience of the interior promenade that brings you through the building, and of course framing the oak tree towards the north. The composite of the interior, the large reading room, you're in the adult section right now, looking towards the adolescent section on the other hand, with the striation of the lighting, the baffles, the beams, with the single pitch of the elongated pediment on the west side, with a storefront that exacerbates the kind of dialogue between inside and the outside, and the incrementally broken up pitches in relationship to smaller programs for the kids on the east side, and the framing of the outdoor spaces with a pool garden on one side and the outdoor reading room in the opposite side. Similar challenges and exercises were done in the Daniels faculty, where for economic reasons, it had to be a very compact building, but for strategic urbanistic reasons, it had to be a landscape building. And so all of our effort was put into finding terraces that had direct and immediate uses from the inside towards the outside. This is important because Spadina Circle that you see on the left, occupied by what was the existing neo-Gothic Knox College, anchored the south with the potential of inserting classrooms, offices, and seminar rooms in it. What the school needed was a large studio space. What we couldn't get in Melbourne, we put here, with the idea of saving the tower as part of the vista, but also expanding in wings to the base that was the landscape, enlivening landscape rooms, as it were, as a central part of the commitment to reactivating the urbanism around what was a roundabout now is an actual pedestrian space enlivened by bicycles and a safe way to cross from one side to the other. While the symbolic facades are on the north and south, the actual active urbanism of the site is on the east-west, connecting UT campus to the Kensington neighborhood. And so the inner street is what tethers together the cafe, the mailboxes, the Fab Lab in that center space, and the auditorium and the library as a piece of urbanism that is open 24/7. And so within that space, you get to see the studio above, you get to see the Fab Lab in Spadina North right through the Oculus. And it's a central part of connecting that back to the urbanism, what becomes very critical during the time of pandemic, where the stage and the connection between indoor and outdoor became one of the dominant classrooms and is now used like that for outdoor lectures and a central part of the urbanism of the site. Something we hadn't anticipated, of course, but that enlivened the strategy of the project. The other protagonist of the building is that it's a concrete building, essentially, borrowing Candela's idea of the shell roof as a critical mechanism to span over 100 feet to create the studio space. All of that is generated out of a central space, the courtyard of Knox College, where an auditorium much like this extends out into other classrooms that are windows that are for the kind of leak out spaces for packed lectures. And so in instances, you see that studio space beyond and you occupy it, when those lectures leak out, revealing also the main studio space that is part of that arena, connecting you back to Spadina North. So we were communicated with by the contractors in what would be a very late stage of the design, telling us that the roof that we designed was unbuildable and in effect also unaffordable. But we said, why? If Candela did it, how come we can't do it? But anyway, it was $1 million over. And so we went through a patient exercise explaining to them how this might be done. But ultimately, as you know, through the value engineering process, it was impossible. So what we did is we said, okay, what if we translate a concrete building into a steel building and built the mock-up in the context of our own studio space using a stick system? And the key here was an environmental one, not a constructive one, that the heating would be in the ground, in the concrete, but that the cooling would be in a radiant panel above coming down. And the structure was a stick system, essentially, which could be erected in half the time and without the formwork, so much less labor. And so it was built for $800,000 less, allowing for a lot of the things that you and I do in the context of installations to translate into a larger, let's say, political capacity in the context of engaging in the means and methods of construction to change the way that we think. So I'm almost at the end and can end whenever you want me to. But it takes me back to MIT where we were together. And as I stepped down, we were commissioned to do Site 4 dormitories and the gateway, which is a central part of bringing East Cambridge to MIT's East Quad that connects to the Infinite Corridor through a gateway, which essentially has all of the MBTA head houses and an elongated gate, which is the length of the entire block that is articulated by what was the MIT bookstore that brings you from Main Street all the way to the East Quad. The drawing that brings this together, of course, begins as an urban diagram connecting the two sides of Main Street, the main promenade that brings you down into the East Quad, engaging in the admissions arena as well as the MIT Museum, transitioning a gate from a thin to a deep prospect, the diagonal connecting to the Infinite Corridor, the identification of the cores into the MBTA, and the promenade that stitches the whole thing together, rotating, poching down into the plan, connecting to the regional scale as one goes into the MBTA, and then rotating into section to allow for the kind of immersion of that promenade to the street at the incremental level, at the human scale, while at the civic scale, allowing the canopy to land on you, that is something larger than the sum of its parts, rotated into perspective to allow for that kind of immersive space of the building. Very different than our other constructions. This borrows not from the incremental aggregate notion of construction, but going to the aviation and boat industry to create two composite shell structures fabricated in Maine, transported into the site, and erected in, sorry, it's a little bit too loud. Essentially installed in one sunny day that was not windy, straddling the columns almost like acupuncture. Allowing for tolerances so that the columns could be wiggled and the two shells nested into each other, minimizing the complexities that would otherwise be afforded by the traditional mode of construction, where beams, joists, ceiling panels, and a range of things would have required, and then the connection back to the skyline of Boston. An image of it on just a pre-opening day. Now it's open and quite active. So I'll end with a quick postscript. A building that has gone up in the last month, prefabricated also, an expansion to the University of Nebraska's School of Architecture, which emerges from this dialogue about representation, spanning from the urbanism of connecting the upper and lower campus through what they call the link between the existing buildings, urbanizing the auditorium into social spaces, exhibition spaces at the base of the building, connecting the buildings, framing a courtyard in the center, going from plan, rotating to plan axon, allowing us to read the simple diagram of connecting to the existing core, economizing, a steel structure in the back to mediate between the brick and the CLT in front and the cal wall. The budget of this building is radically limited and low because of the elimination of multiple trades and the rotation now back into elevation, and the illustration of the facade as a framing device that looks back onto the stadium in one direction and the museum in the other as the studio gets northern light. Again, the promenade, the plan of the studio spaces, the urban spaces, and the CLT in action, mediating between the existing levels of the studios, and most importantly, the argument here laid out from constructive terms, the idea that the entire building effectively was framed and built in the last month, about a level per week. And then finally, the argument here laid out that the entirety of this presentation is revolved around this kind of delicate relationship between generative thinking and analytical thinking, that which you do beforehand and that which you do after the fact, both legitimate, but that exact ways of thinking in different passages and modes of drawing that are historically afforded to us. We borrow from history while also beginning to see different ways in which they can impact the way that we work today. Thank you very much. Time for questions. 5 minutes.
Okay, Nader, thank you so much for this amazing talk. And with Mark's permission, we can take 1 or 2 questions, but 5 minutes for Q&A before we move to the next 2:30 session. So we'll take questions. Yeah.
Thank you, Nader. It's a very enjoyable presentation, partially because of the beautiful animations. And my question is about the animation. Of course, it's a very effective communication tool, or the software happened to allow for the animation to be easily made. But what I wonder is there anything inherent in our architecture that makes animation the ideal medium that allows for that smooth transition from one move to another, from one view to another? What's your thinking behind the use of animation? Thanks.
First of all, the purpose of this talk is to talk about the instrumentality of representation. It's all artificial. What we do is not natural. The idea that we use plan cuts and section cuts is a very abstract idea. And even though, let's say, the general public intuitively or sometimes through education can imagine what a plan means, it requires an intellectual mediation to say, well, if you take a knife and you cut this room at 3 foot and you look down on it, this is what it will look like. So there is no pretense to the kind of naturalization of this as a medium. It's completely artificial. What is different, though, is that what we usually do in the analytique is we put in juxtaposition fragments at different scales in different media to show the relationship between the part and the whole. What's different here is that the part and the whole are stitched together through animation. Now, why is that important? Is it shows that there are elements of architecture that simply cannot be represented through non-experiential terms. So there are elements within all of those animations which are about not the still perspective, but the kind of the animate process. I mean, even as I talk to you, my eyes are constantly rotating from left to right. I'm not looking at you in elevation in as much as your eyes are not static. So recognizing that perspective is not natural either, the animate analytique, in my mind, conceptually, is like what anamorphosis is to perspective. It's the oblique view that shows you the artifice of representation at work and how one can critique one's own process through other lenses or through other modalities of vision.
Hi, Nader. I really appreciate that you ended on the CLT project. And something that I found in researching CLT is that it's a different way of assembling, a different way of construction that's a little bit closer to what we do in the studio. It's very stereotomic. It sort of feels like a basswood model, right? And I know that you make a lot of basswood models historically in the office. And I wonder how you imagine this sort of construction innovation affecting the way that you're designing or, coordinating drawings for construction.
Well, for one, we haven't ever, I don't think we've done any projects that radicalize the use of CLT yet. I mean, we've built RISD with a hybrid system using the steel and CLT in what is a subtly clever way, because if it had been all CLT and LVLs, the beams would have been so deep you could not have bored holes into them for the mechanical system. So the composite is very clever in that you can pre-drill all of the steel in there so that the mechanical systems are radically optimized in the context of very pure CLT ceilings that are a foot higher than what the budget would have afforded in the context of dormitories. But the argument is an economic one, not a formal one, in the way that maybe a Jennifer Bonner may have exacted the idea that the CLT is a panel so large that it allows for monolithic carvings and figures that are extraneous to its construction conception. You know, it escapes the aggregate thinking of all of the rest of the projects that I've shown. The part-to-whole relationship can be circumvented, can be short-circuited. So I think both UNL and RISD revolve around a thinking about radical economies. But I should say that I am and would also be interested in that other way of thinking, what Jennifer talks about, which has to do with an argument which is exactly the opposite of what has been our thesis over the last 20, 30 years. And that is that it's not only about representation, it's also about the instrumentality of a material unit in generating form. So if a Gary out there crumples paper and then figures out how to build it, we don't waste that time to do that. It's not about the expression. We exact what it means, how a brick can be laid to radicalize its form, and then only pursue that which construction allows it to give it a certain kind of malleability. The CLT doesn't abide by that principle, because the relationship between the blank and the figure that it ultimately maintains at the end is totally arbitrary. And so as long as you abide by the principle of the least amount of pieces, the least amount of picking of the crane, and the compliance with its structural behavior. Right? So to me, there is a project in there that has yet to be done, at least by us, but I think that others are doing, where we'll see a very interesting construction system coming together, let's say like a very tight puzzle, but with the maximum openings. I mean, the question for that would be, what are the maximum amount of openings for porosity while maintaining the maximum amount of structural coherence, something like that.
Thank you, Nader, and thank you for the questions.